My name is Larry Hopper. I am the client focal point at the office, and Jason Roney, one of our lead forecasters, is the DSS focal point and also in the tropical team. So he's going to be giving mainly the hurricane rundown for the outlook for this season, and I'll be starting you guys off with just the outlooks from CPC. So let's go ahead and get started. So, looking back to the last 6 months, South Central Texas really did get quite a bit of rainfall. Some areas, even in the last 90 days, have had rainfall in excess of 300% out towards Fayette County and towards Houston's area. But again, virtually the entire part of South Central Texas, when you look at percent of normal, is above normal, except for some very isolated pockets right along the Rio Grande, out in the Rio Grande Plains. So therefore, it's not surprising that we are not expecting any drought conditions to develop this summer. You can see that Texas, for the most part, is drought-free aside for some areas out towards El Paso, and there's no reason to believe over the next 3 months or so that any drought is going to develop. Now, to kind of get you in the framework for what we should expect for this time of year, as you can see, we had severe weather season just starting to finish here in the middle of June. You can see that our hail, thunderstorm, wind, and tornado reports drop off dramatically during June and drop off to very low numbers in July. But you can see that our flash flood reports steadily increase. So obviously we had a lot of flash flooding in April and May. That tends to increase in June and July and then begins to drop back off towards August before having a quick peak in September, October, and November. And so really our main threat for this time of year is flash flooding. When we're looking at any sort of severe threat, the main threat is typically winds, and any sort of tornadoes that we typically get this time of year are typically going to be associated with tropical systems and just single cell thunderstorms that very rarely do produce tornadoes. And so they just want to get you oriented with what we're looking at for this time of year, which is really flash flood events, and typically more localized heavy rainfall as opposed to widespread flash flood events, unless, of course, we get a tropical system. Taking a look forward for the rest of this month, the Climate Prediction Center is predicting that temperatures for the most part should begin to cool back to normal once we get through this weekend. We do have the possibility of some backdoor weak cold front kind of approaching the region to kind of help with this. And the ridge that's currently over us will kind of move to the north and west a little bit. So that should give us the opportunity to kind of get back closer to normal. However, we are expecting that some storms on the southern periphery of the ridge will be able to give us the odds tilted towards some greater than normal precipitation for at least next week. Also, some tropical influences is quite possible there as well. So you get to days 8 through 14, we go more towards next weekend, and the following week we don't really have a tilt towards either direction. Of course, as we move into July, Climate Prediction Center actually released this morning, where they have a tilt towards a wetter than normal summer, particularly along the Gulf course into the I-35 corridor. And we are one region where they're actually predicting an equal chance of either above or below normal temperatures, whereas most of the country is above normal. They believe that because of the soil moisture that we have in place from our wet spring, that's going to be enough to possibly give us a lower chance of having above normal temperatures, such that they've got us in the equal chance there. So we move forward to July through September, which includes August and September. You can see that they're still holding on to the slight tilt towards above normal precipitation along the Gulf Coast into the I-35 corridor. And we are the one location, southeast Texas and parts of south central Texas, that is still put in that equal chance of temperatures being close to normal framework. And so once again, while most of the country is going to be above normal, they are still saying that we might actually be closer to normal for this period. So again, the main reason that they have that in there is that typically when we have a wet spring like we did last year and like we did this year, typically the above normal soil moisture helps keep temperatures below normal to some extent, or at least near normal, and keeps the number of 100 degrees days down that tend to drive that above normal signal in our average temperature. And so you can see that San Antonio has typically got 12 days above 100 degrees over the 30-year normal period, whereas Austin has 18. But if you start to look at the wettest 10 years, which this year and last year would have qualified, you can see that typically we have about half of that. Whereas if we're in the driest 10 years, we typically have sometimes double that, or at least 50 to 60% more than normal. But it's important to realize that trends for the long-term climate pattern due to climate change is showing that the 100-degree days are increasing. And so even though the soil moisture should help keep our temperatures down, one thing to keep in mind is that last year they didn't. We actually had I believe 24 days in Austin and 12 days in San Antonio, which are just right at normal or just slightly above for 100-degree days, which allowed our temperatures last summer, once we got into a drier pattern, to be slightly above normal for the whole summer period. And so even though we do have the possibility of having, some lower 100-degree days because of our soil moisture, it's important to realize that the long-term trend has 100-degree days increasing, and that's one reason why you see most of the country in general being put towards above normal temperatures. Rainfall is always a little trickier in the summer. There's not usually a very clear teleconnective signal with El Nino, except some slight signal with La Nina for hurricanes that Jason will talk about. The MJO, the Madden-Julian oscillation, is another signal that typically can affect our summertime rainfall, but right now it does not look like it's going to have a strong influence, at least for the next month or so. So when we look at the past cases of what has happened when we transition from a moderate to strong El Nino that we just were in to ENSO neutral conditions, which you'll see in just a second that we are in, and possibly even La Nina, which we may get into by the end of the summer, you can see that 3 of these 4 years have been wet. So 1983, 1998, and 2010 are all cases where we are significantly above our average of 8.79 inches, and in some cases quite a bit above in 2010. And if you start to look at these cases, as you'll see towards the end of the presentation, in 2010 and 1998 there was a heavy influence of tropical storms and even hurricanes those 2 years that really pushed this number up. Whereas in 1992 we didn't really have that. Hurricane Andrew went off to our east. And as well, Hurricane Alicia in 1983 stayed off to our east, but we still had a steady string of rainfall there. So there is some slight tilt towards having wetter than normal conditions statistically, which CPC mentioned, which when we look deeper at our local climate, you can see that it's partly due to tropical influences. So going back to El Nino has been replaced by neutral conditions. You can see that right now in the Nino 3.4 region that we use the most, we are now basically right at 0 degrees Celsius with no anomaly either way. But of course, the trend's what's important. We're really rapidly going from warmer than normal temperatures in the East Pacific down to normal temperatures and most likely into lower than normal temperatures within the next couple of months. So ENSO neutral conditions are present. The CPC has issued their final El Nino advisory, and they've also issued a La Nina watch for what we're likely going to go into over the next couple of months. So the big question for this summer is whether or not neutral conditions will transition to La Nina fast enough to affect our hurricane season. And at least half the models, as you can see up here in the IRA CPC plot up here in the upper right, half the models are really predicting that La Nina will develop in August. And certainly by September, October, CPC is predicting a 75% chance that La Nina will develop by this fall and winter. And so just to keep things in perspective, several times, not every time, but more than half the time, we've gone from strong El Nino conditions. We have transitioned immediately into La Nina conditions afterwards, and at the very least, ENSO neutral conditions. So this is something to watch as we move forward to see whether or not that happens. I believe in 83 that did not happen. We ended up having a pretty cool winter, but in 98 and 2010 we did go straight to La Nina. So having said that, I'm going to let Jason talk about the hurricane outlook and the wrap up.
Thanks, Larry. So continuing on with ENSO, one of the things that we look for as far as seasonal outlooks in the tropics in the Atlantic Basin is what phase of ENSO we're in. There's a signal that when we are in the El Nino phase, that tends to produce more wind shear across the Caribbean and Atlantic Basin, which tends to result in below normal tropical activity. And as you can recall from the past 2 tropical seasons, it has been normal to below normal as far as number of named storms. On the flip side, when we go into La Nina, that tends to result in lower wind shear across the Caribbean and Atlantic Basin. And so that tends to result in near to above normal tropical activity in that basin. This slide here, if you concentrate on the bottom and top left images, these are the neutral years and the La Nina years, and these stand out by far from the top right image, which are El Nino years. So you're looking at tropical cyclones and the different phases of ENSO. And during the neutral and La Nina years, you can definitely see much more activity in the Atlantic Basin. If you pay attention to the western Gulf of Mexico and compare that to the El Nino years, there's definitely much more in the way of tropical activities in neutral and La Nina years in the western Gulf of Mexico. The NOAA Atlantic outlook, the official outlook, calls for 10 to 16 named storms. This would be near to slightly above normal, 4 to 8 hurricanes and 1 to 4 major hurricanes. The main thing to point out here is that they're basically giving a 75% probability that we will have a near to above normal tropical season in the Atlantic basin, as opposed to a only 25% chance of a below normal season. And on the flip side, in the eastern Pacific Ocean, which typically during El Niños results in active seasons, in La Niña seasons it results in below normal tropical activity. One of the other things that we look at as far as steering of tropical systems is the positioning of the subtropical high, and that can be affected by what phase of the North Atlantic oscillation we're in. During the negative phase of this tends to drive tropical systems more westward through the Caribbean and into the Gulf of Mexico. During the positive phase of the NAO, this tends to steer systems more north and northeastwards towards the Atlantic seaboard. So when we get into this negative or weak phase of the NAO combined with La Niñas, this is something that we pay attention for in the western Gulf of Mexico. The difficulty is that the NAO is hard to predict when you're out more than 2 weeks in advance. So we can't really tell as we get into August or September when we are forecasting the possibility of a La Nina. Well, we can't really tell if the NAO will be there this far out. Some climatology. The right image here represents tropical cyclones that have impacted Texas, the state of Texas. These are direct hits to the state of Texas by month. And you can see that the peak of the hurricane season, August and September, Texas being affected. There's a secondary peak at the beginning of the tropical season during June, and this kind of lull during the month of July that we look for. Another statistic to point out is the longest hurricane-free period that the state of Texas has ever gone is 10 years, from 1989 to 1999. We are currently at 8 years, being Hurricane Ike in 2008 was the last direct landfalling hurricane that we've had. So looking at this from a climatological standpoint, we are getting up there towards our longest hurricane-free period on record. As we get into some of the impacts that we're looking for, as far as tropical activity, from now through July, we would expect normal tropical activity. And then if we do transition, if indeed we do transition into the La Nina, into August and September, odds would point towards normal to slightly above normal tropical activity in the western Gulf of Mexico. As far as excessive heat, as Larry mentioned, with the soil moisture in place, we don't expect excessive air temperatures, but with the near-surface moisture and the dew points in place, that could result in heat advisory days, especially as we get into our warmer months of August and September. Just a reminder, we did change our heat advisory criteria last season, and so heat advisories are now issued across our eastern and central counties when we have heat indexes of 108 degrees or more, or an air temperature of 103 degrees. Whereas the Rio Grande Plains, we look for heat indexes and air temperatures of 110 degrees. As far as the fire weather goes, I want to point out these bottom two images. These are looking at energy release component, which is basically a function of the potential for larger fire growth. Right image on the bottom, the central Texas region. The red line represents max values of ERC indices that we've ever seen during the months of the year. The gray line is the average. The black line is this year, 2016, and the dashed blue line is last year, 2015. And so you can see as we came out of May and June last year and this year, our energy release component indices were very low. We had come out of a very wet period, so the fire potential was basically slightly below normal last year, and that will continue this year through late June and July. Now, if we transition into a dry period and we don't get the tropical moisture in August and September, we'll have to watch out for drying of those fuels, and we could trend towards more of a normal to slightly above normal if we don't get the rainfall as far as fire weather conditions go. And so Larry mentioned that the main cause of heavy rainfall and above normal precipitation during the summer months in south central Texas is from tropical systems, such as in 1998 Tropical Storm Charlie and Tropical Storm Francis, and again in 2010 Hurricane Alex and Tropical Storm Hermine. And so if we were to see normal to above normal chances for heavy rainfall this year, it would come from tropical systems. If we don't get any tropical systems this year, then expect normal to below normal chances for heavy rainfall. Sneak peek for a fall outlook. We'll have another call sometime September or maybe early October. We'll discuss more on the trends of the ENSO into La Nina conditions and what that points to towards the fall and especially the winter months. Typically we see drier than normal winter months and above normal temperatures, so we'll discuss that in our fall outlook. So on behalf of Dr. Larry Hopper, this is Jason Runyon. We thank you for watching the South Central Texas Summer Climate Outlook webinar. Stay tuned for the fall outlook coming sometime late September or October.